The fog never really lifts in the little hollow the locals call Widow's Lap, even when the rest of the Smoky Mountains basks in October gold. It clings to the pines like wet wool and turns every footstep into a secret. Back in the fall of 1974, a graduate student from Knoxville named Daniel Raymer found a tiny red Keds sneaker lying beside the trail, sole cracked, laces still tied in perfect bows. He meant to carry it out, maybe turn it in at the ranger station, but that evening he heard women singing somewhere below the ridge, two voices weaving together like smoke through a keyhole. The song had no words he recognized, yet it pulled him downhill through laurel thickets until the trees parted and a lantern glowed on a porch he would swear had not been there at dawn. Everyone who ever spent the night at that cabin described the same thing afterward: the sudden smell of apples and wood smoke, the older sister's soft hand on your elbow guiding you inside, the way the younger one watched from the staircase with eyes the color of creek ice. They gave you warm cider that tasted faintly of iron and cloves. They insisted you were too tired to pitch a tent in the dark. They had a spare room, they said, with a feather bed so deep you'd sink like you were falling through years. Most men laughed about it later, if they got the chance to laugh at all, how two kindly spinsters in their late 50s had saved them from a cold night on the ground. Only 15 never walked out by morning. Their names are still carved into a granite plaque at Newfound Gap, though the Park Service lists the cause as exposure or animal predation. The rangers never found tents, packs, or bodies. They only ever found silence, and sometimes, years later, a polished finger bone tucked inside the cold belly of an old home comfort stove that hadn't been lit since the night the Mountain Sisters disappeared. People still hear the singing when the wind moves the wrong way through the hollow. Two voices, always two, drifting up from somewhere the crow flies can't quite locate. And if you're alone on the trail after the sun drops behind Clingman's Dome, you might feel the fog settle on your shoulders like a woman's hand, gentle, guiding, already leading you downhill toward a lantern that has no right to be burning at all. October 1974 arrived early in the Smokies, the kind of cold that slips under your collar and stays there. Daniel Raymer, 26, lean from a summer of field research, was finishing the Tennessee section of the Appalachian Trail alone because his advisor had called it character-building solitude. He had been walking south from Davenport Gap for 9 straight days, sleeping in lean-tos, eating peanut butter straight from the jar, speaking to no one but the occasional thru-hiker who nodded and kept moving. By the time he reached the high balds above Tricorner Knob, the leaves were already blood-red and the wind carried the first real threat of winter. Late on the 9th afternoon he left the marked trail for a short stretch, hunting a rumored overlook that wasn't on any map. The side path was faint, nothing more than a deer run choked with rhododendron, but it promised a view clear to the French Broad if the light held. The sun was already sliding behind the ridgeline when he pushed through a stand of spruce and felt the ground drop away beneath him. Fog rose from the valley in slow, deliberate breaths, erasing the world below the waist. That was when he saw the shoe. It lay half-buried in a tangle of galax leaves, small enough for a child, fire engine red faded almost pink, the canvas split along one seam. The rubber toe cap still held the ghost of a smiley face sticker. Daniel crouched, brushed dirt from the eyelets, and saw that the laces were tied in perfect double bows, the kind of mother knots so they won't come undone. No foot could have slipped out without untying them first. He turned the sneaker over in his gloved hands, puzzled by how clean it was, as if it had been waiting there only a day or two instead of seasons. Then the singing started. 2 women's voices, low and sweet, rose through the fog from somewhere far below the ridge. No echo, no bounce off the mountainside, just pure sound finding him as if the air itself had decided to carry it straight to his ears. The tune was old, something between a hymn and a lullaby, minor notes curling like wood smoke. Daniel stood very still, the child's shoe dangling from his fingers, and felt the hair lift along his arms. The voices were close enough that he should have seen the singers, yet the fog refused to part. They sang in perfect unison, then split into harmony that tightened his chest the way altitude sometimes does. He took one involuntary step downhill, then another, the trail behind him already swallowed by mist. The red Ked swung like a pendulum as he moved toward the sound, drawn by a pull older than reason, the same pull that would, years later, guide 15 solitary men to a lantern on a porch that maps had forgotten to draw, explain key point number 2 into 450 words, without any subheadings or ending sentence. By the spring of 1975 the Mountain Sisters had settled into a quiet, almost tender routine that no one in Cosby or Gatlinburg thought to question. Cora, the elder at 58, kept her iron gray hair twisted in a knot and wore the same faded calico dress until the elbows shone. Lena, 3 years younger, let her pale hair hang loose down her back like a girl's and moved with a silence that made visitors think of creek water sliding over stones. Their cabin sat 2 miles off any maintained trail, tucked into the crease locals called Widow's Lap, a place the Park Service had never quite mapped because the ridgelines folded in on themselves like closed fists. They began appearing at dusk along the Appalachian Trail whenever the shelters were full or the weather turned mean. Cora carried a willow basket covered with a red-checked cloth. Lena walked a few paces behind, humming under her breath. They never asked for money, never raised their voices. They simply waited until some lone hiker, always male, always traveling light, always far from anyone who expected a postcard, paused to tighten a bootlace or study a blister. Then Cora would smile the way a grandmother smiles at a child who has wandered too far from the picnic blanket and say, "You look half-drowned, sugar. We've got a pot of cider on and a roof that doesn't leak. It's only a little ways down the holler." Most men hesitated. Pride is a heavy thing at 25. But the sisters had a way of making refusal feel rude. Lena would tilt her head and add softly, "We keep the spare room for folks just like you," and the words sounded so reasonable, so kind, that the hiker would find himself nodding before the thought finished forming. They never carried flashlights. The sisters said they knew every route and stone by heart. Instead they walked ahead, 2 dark shapes against the last smear of light, and the traveler followed the rustle of Cora's skirt and the faint scent of apples that always seemed to drift from her basket. At the cabin the door stood open before they reached the porch, as though someone inside had been watching. A single kerosene lamp glowed on the table, throwing long shadows across walls papered in tiny faded roses. The air smelled of wood smoke, cinnamon, and something deeper, metallic, like a butcher's block left too long in the rain. Cora pressed a tin mug of steaming cider into the hiker's hands while Lena took his pack without asking and set it beside the staircase that rose into darkness. "Drink," Cora murmured. "It'll warm what the trail took out of you." And the cider was sweet, almost thick on the tongue, carrying a warmth that spread through the chest and loosened every knot of caution until the room itself seemed to breathe slower, until the idea of walking back into the night felt absurd, impossible. Almost ungrateful when 2 kind women had gone to such trouble for a stranger who had nothing to offer but tired feet and tomorrow's miles. The first man to accept the sisters' hospitality was Elias Ward, 29, a schoolteacher from Asheville trying to outrun a divorce he hadn't yet admitted was final. On the evening of June 12, 1975, he scribbled a quick entry in the trail register at Peck's Corner Shelter, "Met 2 sweet old gals heading downhill, free cider and a real bed tonight. Tell my ex I'm finally sleeping in style." He signed it with a flourish and a winking smiley face, then shouldered his pack and followed Cora and Lena into the dusk. 3 weeks later a pair of rangers found the same pack leaning against a laurel bush exactly 1 mile from where the side trail to Widow's Lap simply stopped existing. The aluminum frame was undamaged, the rain cover still snapped in place. Inside, everything was exactly as Elias had left it, half a block of cheddar wrapped in wax paper, a dog-eared copy of Walden, 1 clean pair of socks folded the way his mother had taught him. Only 2 things were wrong. His wallet lay open on top, driver's license facing up like it was waiting to be checked, every bill still tucked inside. And on the plastic mouth of his Nalgene bottle someone had left a perfect crescent of coral pink lipstick, the kind sold in drugstores for 98 cents, the kind neither Cora nor Lena had ever been seen wearing. The rangers carried the pack out and filed the report under "possible mental health episode." They chalked the lipstick up to a prank by another hiker, maybe someone Elias had argued with over shelter space. They did not walk the extra mile into Widow's Lap because the fog was thick that day and the dogs refused to follow the scent past the laurel. By the time anyone thought to ask the sisters about a missing teacher from Asheville, Cora was already standing on her porch shelling peas, humming the same lullaby Elias had heard drifting uphill the night he followed her lantern. She told the deputy she hadn't seen a soul since the wild azaleas bloomed, and offered him a bowl of the peas still warm from the sun. He took them, thanked her, and forgot to write down the date. No one ever found Elias's boots, his watch, or the silver wedding band he still wore despite the divorce papers. The only trace that traveled farther than the laurel bush was the faint smell of apples and smoke that clung to his sleeping bag for weeks, no matter how many times the rangers aired it out on the clothesline behind the station. And somewhere in the hollow, the cast-iron stove in the sisters' kitchen burned a little hotter that summer, fed by logs no one saw them split and kindling no one saw them gather. By the fall of 1981 the disappearances had carved a quiet, crooked scar across 7 seasons of trail registers. 15 names, 15 solitary men aged 24 to 38, all vanished within the same 10-mile knot of ridgelines that park maps shaded as unmaintained area, no facilities. Their last entries were almost tender in their gratitude. 2 angel ladies saved me from a thunderstorm, real bed, hot soup, felt like my grandma's house. Met Cora and Lena at dusk, best cider I've ever tasted, slept 12 hours straight. Kind sisters downhill from Cosby Gap, don't miss the apple butter if they offer. The men were always alone, always hiking southbound, always carrying just enough gear to suggest they had no one waiting for them at the next road crossing. A graduate student from Virginia Tech, a discharged Marine walking off Vietnam, a photographer from Atlanta chasing autumn color, a carpenter who told shelter companions he was tired of being around people. Their packs turned up eventually, placed neatly off-trail like offerings, wallets untouched, film canisters unopened, journals closed on the same day the handwriting stopped. Each water bottle, each cookpot lip, each metal cup bore the same faint coral crescent of lipstick no lab could match to any commercial brand after 1978. Rangers began calling the stretch the Quiet 10. Through hikers repeated rumors the way they repeated warnings about bears: stay in groups, don't follow unmarked paths after dark, don't drink anything you didn't watch being poured. Yet every year at least one man decided the stories were exaggeration, that 2 old women couldn't possibly be dangerous, that a warm bed was worth the detour when the temperature dropped into the 30s and the shelters were already full of snoring strangers. They left the trail at dusk, drawn by the smell of wood smoke and apples drifting uphill against the wind, by the sound of 2 women singing harmony soft enough to feel like a memory you hadn't lived yet. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. Only absence, sudden and complete, as if the mountain simply inhaled. The missing were commemorated on a brass plaque bolted to a boulder at Newfound Gap, names added one by one as the years passed, the metal growing green with lichen around the edges. Hikers paused to read them the way they paused at grave markers in old churchyards, then shouldered their packs and kept walking, telling themselves the fog was just fog, the singing just wind threading through hemlocks, the faint glow far below the ridge nothing more than moonlight on a tin roof someone had forgotten to map. By the fall of 1981 the disappearances had carved a quiet, crooked scar across 7 seasons of trail registers. 15 names, 15 solitary men aged 24 to 38, all vanished within the same 10-mile knot of ridgelines that park maps shaded as unmaintained area, no facilities. Their last entries were almost tender in their gratitude. 2 angel ladies saved me from a thunderstorm, real bed, hot soup, felt like my grandma's house. Met Cora and Lena at dusk, best cider I've ever tasted, slept 12 hours straight. Kind sisters downhill from Cosby Gap, don't miss the apple butter if they offer. The men were always alone, always hiking southbound, always carrying just enough gear to suggest they had no one waiting for them at the next road crossing. A graduate student from Virginia Tech, a discharged Marine walking off Vietnam, a photographer from Atlanta chasing autumn color, a carpenter who told shelter companions he was tired of being around people. Their packs turned up eventually, placed neatly off-trail like offerings, wallets untouched, film canisters unopened, journals closed on the same day the handwriting stopped. Each water bottle, each cookpot lip, each metal cup bore the same faint coral crescent of lipstick no lab could match to any commercial brand after 1978. Rangers began calling the stretch the Quiet 10. Through hikers repeated rumors the way they repeated warnings about bears: stay in groups, don't follow unmarked paths after dark, don't drink anything you didn't watch being poured. Yet every year at least one man decided the stories were exaggeration, that 2 old women couldn't possibly be dangerous, that a warm bed was worth the detour when the temperature dropped into the 30s and the shelters were already full of snoring strangers. They left the trail at dusk, drawn by the smell of wood smoke and apples drifting uphill against the wind, by the sound of 2 women singing harmony soft enough to feel like a memory you hadn't lived yet. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. Only absence, sudden and complete, as if the mountain simply inhaled. The missing were commemorated on a brass plaque bolted to a boulder at Newfound Gap, names added one by one as the years passed, the metal growing green with lichen around the edges. Hikers paused to read them the way they paused at grave markers in old churchyards, then shouldered their packs and kept walking, telling themselves the fog was just fog, the singing just wind threading through hemlocks, the faint glow far below the ridge nothing more than moonlight on a tin roof someone had forgotten to map. Deputy Sheriff Harlan Tate had been driving the Cosby, Greenbrier loop since Nixon was president, and he knew every hollow, every still, every porch where a man could sit and whittle away a Sunday. By the summer of 1979 the rumors had finally crawled into his cruiser and nested there, too many lone hikers mentioning the same two old women, too many packs found empty of their owners, too many trail register entries that ended with the same grateful scrawl about hot cider and a feather bed. Harlan was 47, thick around the middle, slow to anger, and stubborn the way only mountain-born men get stubborn. He decided to pay a visit. He went alone, no warrant, no backup, just a paper sack of tomatoes from his wife's garden and the excuse that he was checking on the ladies after the flood rains. The side road quit halfway up the ridge, after that it was boot leather and briars. He found the cabin the way everyone else did, by following the smell of wood smoke that drifted uphill against the wind. Cora was on the porch snapping beans into an enamel bowl, the green hulls flicking away like tiny grasshoppers. Lena sat in the rocker, pale hair loose, rocking slow enough that the chains never creaked. Harlan took off his hat the way his mother taught him and offered the tomatoes. Cora smiled the way Sunday school teachers smile at children who've tracked mud across the sanctuary, patient, forgiving, and just a little tired. She thanked him for the gift, pressed a jar of blackberry jam into his hand still warm from the stove, and told him the path had washed out worse than usual this year. Lena never spoke, only watched with those creek ice eyes while her foot kept the rocker moving in perfect silence. He asked about the hikers. Cora's hands never paused among the beans. She said yes, a few poor boys had needed shelter from storms, of course they'd helped, the Lord didn't like to see folks suffer. They always left at first light, full of breakfast and gratitude. She couldn't recall a single name, bless their hearts, faces blurred together after a while. The jam smelled of summer and something darker underneath, like smoke trapped in the berries. Harlan turned the jar in his thick fingers and felt the heat soak through his palm. He asked if he could look around. Cora's smile thinned just enough to notice. She said the house was small and they were private women, but he was welcome to walk the garden if he liked. He walked the rows of tomatoes and pole beans instead, boots sinking into the soft earth, noting how straight the furrows ran, how nothing grew wild within 50 yards of the porch. When he came back Cora was waiting with another jar, this one peach preserves the color of sunrise. She told him to drive safe, the road was slippery after rain. Lena's rocker had stopped moving. Harlan left with 2 jars in his cruiser and the taste of iron at the back of his throat he couldn't rinse away no matter how many times he spat out the window on the long drive down. He never wrote the visit in the logbook, never told the rangers, never opened either jar. They sat on a shelf in his garage until the day he retired, labels curling, fruit inside gone dark and quiet. November 1981 came in like a slammed door. A Canadian high-pressure system collided with warm Gulf air and birthed a storm the old-timers still call the Thanksgiving blizzard. It started as rain on the 20th, turned to sleet by nightfall, then to heavy, wet snow that bent the rhododendrons double and buried the trail under 2 feet before anyone reached for chainsaws. Power lines snapped across Sevier County, roads closed, and the Park Service grounded every helicopter from Knoxville to Asheville. By the morning of the 23rd the entire high country was locked in white silence broken only by the crack of overloaded hemlocks splitting down the middle. Search and rescue teams from Gatlinburg and Cherokee waited at the plowed line on Newfound Gap Road, engines idling, chains clinking, radios hissing with static. 15 men were still unaccounted for on the Tennessee side alone, some overdue by days, some by years, but the storm had finally given the Rangers an excuse to go off-trail in force. They carried avalanche probes, cadaver dogs flown in from Virginia, and court orders that had taken 4 seasons to obtain. Their target was Widow's Lap, the hollow no map acknowledged, the place where every missing hiker's last known direction pointed like iron filings to a magnet. The dogs hit the scent 2 miles above the cabin and refused to go farther. Handlers dragged them forward on leashes, but the animals dug in, whining, tails tucked so hard their hindquarters trembled. One Malinois lay down in the snow and vomited. The handlers finally unclipped the leads and let them bolt back toward the plowed road, ears flat, refusing to look behind them. The men pressed on without the dogs, faces wrapped in balaclavas, headlamps cutting tunnels through the blowing snow. They followed a single set of old footprints, small, narrow, spaced like a woman's, that had not filled in despite 36 hours of storm. The tracks led straight to the cabin chimney, the only structure for miles still pushing a thin, steady ribbon of smoke into the blizzard. When they broke through the last screen of laurel the cabin looked almost welcoming, yellow lamplight in the windows, snow sliding off the tin roof in heavy sheets, a thin gray plume rising straight up because the wind had died the moment they crossed the property line. The temperature inside the circle of cleared yard was 20 degrees warmer than on the ridge above, as though the hollow itself had decided to hold autumn a little longer. The searchers spread out, boots creaking on the frozen porch boards, breath fogging the air, rifles unslung but not raised. Somewhere inside that chimney something burned that smelled less like oak and more like fat dripping onto hot iron. The smell of Sunday supper carried too far. The searchers forced the door at dusk, the blizzard still howling outside like something cheated of its prey. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than the yard, almost humid, as though the stove had been stoked for days without a single window cracked. The kerosene lamps were lit and turned low, wicks trimmed so perfectly the flames barely moved. A pot of cider simmered on the back burner, apples bobbing lazily, filling the room with the same sweet iron smell every survivor had mentioned and then forgotten. No one answered when the team leader called out. The sisters were not in the kitchen, not on the narrow staircase, not in the spare room with its quilt still turned down in invitation. They found the stove first because it dominated the room the way a hearth dominates a church. It was a home comfort triple burner, black iron polished until it shone like obsidian, the kind of relic mail-ordered in 1910 and never replaced. The firebox door stood ajar, heat rolled out in slow, deliberate waves. One ranger, a man from Maryville who had grown up with wood stoves, reached for the poker hanging on its hook and hesitated. The ashes inside were wrong, too white, too fine, layered like years of winters compressed into inches. He raked once, gently, and the ashes sighed apart to reveal a bundle wrapped in yellowed oilcloth wedged against the back wall where no log could ever fit. When he pulled it free, the cloth unrolled like a butcher's paper, spilling 15 small bones across the pine floor. Finger bones, every one, cut clean at the proximal joint with a blade finer than any hunting knife the rangers carried. They were polished smooth, almost ivory, as though they had been handled daily, worried like rosary beads or worry stones. Some still wore flecks of charred tissue, others were bare and gleaming. Each bone bore a tiny Roman numeral scratched near the knuckle, I threw 15, etched so delicately the marks looked made by a sewing needle rather than a knife. The room went quieter than the storm outside. Someone's breath caught hard enough to echo. The youngest ranger backed into the table and knocked over a jar of blackberry jam. It shattered, dark syrup spreading like blood across the boards. No one moved to clean it. They simply stared at the bones arranged in unintentional order, 15 silent accusations that had waited 7 years inside the heart of the fire itself, kept warm, kept close, kept secret by the same hands that had offered cider and quilts to exhausted men who only wanted one night of kindness in the wilderness. The bones were bagged and tagged before the storm eased enough for the helicopters to lift off. By midnight the cabin stood empty for the first time in decades, evidence markers glowing yellow under the rangers' headlamps, the shattered jam jar still bleeding purple across the floorboards. A deputy from Sevier County nailed a warrant to the front door and posted 2 men to watch the place until morning, figuring the sisters might try to slip back for whatever they couldn't bear to leave. The men brewed coffee on a camp stove and took turns walking the porch, rifles loose in their arms, listening to the snow settle into silence. At 3:17 a.m. the younger deputy noticed the lamps inside had gone out. He stepped through the doorway to check the wicks and found every flame snuffed clean, no smoke, no smell of kerosene, just cold glass chimneys and darkness thick enough to taste. When he swung his flashlight beam across the kitchen, the stove door hung open and the firebox was dead, ashes scattered as though someone had raked them in a hurry. The poker lay on the floor, still warm. He called to his partner, voice cracking on the second syllable, and together they searched every room twice. The quilts were folded, the cider pot washed and appended on the drain board, the mason jars of jam lined up like soldiers who had deserted their posts. In the spare room the feather bed bore no indentation, no warmth, as if no one had ever sunk into it. Outside, the snow around the cabin was untouched except for the team's own boot prints leading in. No tracks led out, no narrow women's prints, no dragged bundles, no sign that anyone had crossed the porch after the evidence crew sealed the scene. The deputies radioed it in, voices thin with something close to fear, and the dispatcher told them to hold position until daylight. They sat in their cruiser with the engine running, watching the windows for any flicker of returning light, jumping at every creak of the tin roof cooling in the wind. By the time the sun rose pale and reluctant over the ridge, the cabin had been stripped of its last breath of occupancy. Drawers stood open and empty, the willow basket gone from its hook, even the red-checked cloth missing from the table. Only one thing remained out of place, a small reel-to-reel tape on the mantel above the stove, its plastic case fogged with cold, labeled in Cora's careful script with 2 words in faded indigo ink, Voices in the Dark. The deputies turned it over in gloved hands, puzzled by its weight, by the way the tape inside seemed to shift like something alive trying to settle. They sealed it in an evidence bag without playing it, loaded it into the helicopter with the bones and the lipstick-stained water bottles, and lifted off into a sky finally clear enough to show how completely the hollow had closed its fist around the secret it had kept warm for 7 years. The tape sat in evidence lockup at the Sevier County Courthouse for 9 days while technicians argued over chain of custody and whether the old Akai deck in the property room still worked. On December 8, 1981, they finally threaded it under the watchful eyes of 2 detectives, one FBI liaison, and a prosecutor who kept glancing at the finger bones laid out on a steel tray like pale punctuation marks. The room smelled of coffee and hot dust from the ancient amplifier. Someone hit play. At first there was only the softest hiss of oxide, the kind of breath a sleeping child makes. Then a single male voice, young, Midwestern, a little hoarse from altitude, began to sing the lullaby everyone in Widow's Lap already knew by heart. The words were the same mountain fragments Cora and Lena had hummed for decades. Go to sleep, little darling, the dark is kind, the fire is warm, but the voice belonged to Elias Ward, recorded the night he drank the cider and never walked out. 30 seconds later a second voice layered underneath, then a third, until 15 distinct timbres overlapped in perfect, terrible harmony. They were not singing together in real time, each track had been laid down separately, at different distances from the microphone, some close enough that you could hear the wet click of a tongue, others faint as if the singer stood at the far end of the cabin's upstairs hall. The detectives leaned forward involuntarily. The voices rose and fell like wind-threading hemlocks, never rushing, never missing a note. When the tape reached the 2-minute mark the voices began dropping out one by one, not fading but stopping clean, as though someone had placed a gentle hand over each mouth in turn. Elias went first, then the Marine from Virginia, then the photographer whose camera had been found full of unshot autumn. Each silence left a small, precise hole in the court until only one voice remained, an exhausted tenor the Rangers recognized as the last missing hiker, a carpenter from Ohio who disappeared 3 weeks before the blizzard. He finished the final phrase alone, voice cracking on the last word, and then even he was gone. The reel kept spinning for another 4 seconds of empty hiss before the take-up spool clicked off. No one spoke for a long time. Outside the window snow started to fall again, soft and deliberate. When the technician finally lifted the tape from the spindles he noticed the brown ribbon now carried 15 faint white scratches, each exactly the length of a fingernail, spaced like tiny ladders across the oxide. They had not been there when the tape was logged in.